The great flood was supposed to kill everything with corrupted blood. But as the waters receded, a 13-foot shadow stood on the mud. God's reset button had a glitch, and his name was Og. You're watching the Forbidden Bible, where the hidden war of angels and demons, the ancient prophecies sealed for the last days, and the forbidden mysteries of Scripture are revealed with cinematic clarity. If you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon, because what you're about to discover may change the way you understand heaven, the unseen realm, and your place within it. Today, we go beyond the Sunday school stories to face the nightmare that survived the apocalypse. History is a collection of things we are told to believe, but archaeology is a collection of things we can't ignore. In the ancient city of Rabbah, there sat a relic that should not exist. It wasn't a gold crown or a sacred scroll. It was a bed, but not a bed for a man. It was 13 feet long and 6 feet wide, forged from solid iron. Why iron? Because at 4 meters tall and weighing nearly 4 tons, King Og would have crushed a wooden frame into splinters just by lying down. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, Moses, the man who saw God in a burning bush, stops a serious war chronicle. He pauses the epic march of Israel just to record the dimensions of furniture. Ask yourself, why? This isn't just flavor text, this is a forensic report. Moses knew that in 2026, skeptics would call the Nephilim a fairy tale, so he pointed to the iron. He said, "Look at the bed, the monster was real." But here is the chilling part. If the flood was God's perfect judgment, meant to scrub the earth's hard drive of every Nephilim, every hybrid, and every genetic abomination, then why did Moses find a breathing fossil 400 years later? Moses sat in his tent, the flickering shadows of the Sinai desert dancing on the walls, and he felt a cold dread in his bones. He wasn't just preparing for a battle. He was preparing for a confrontation with a ghost, a survivor of a world that was deleted. He realized that the flood, the most catastrophic event in human history, had a leak. To understand how the shadow of the old world crossed the ocean of death, we have to look back at the ark, not at what was inside, but what was clinging to the outside. Imagine the rain, not the gentle showers of a spring morning that bring life to the fields, but a sky that had turned into a relentless, suffocating weapon. The fountains of the great deep burst forth with the force of 1,000 volcanoes, and for 40 days the earth was not just being flooded, it was being unmade. The very atmosphere tasted of salt, mud, and the metallic tang of divine wrath. Inside the ark, Noah sat in a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight against his chest. He listened to the world die. At first, there were the screams, thousands of voices rising in a jagged chorus of terror. Then came the desperate roaring of prehistoric beasts, the elephants and the lions of the old world struggling against the rising tide. Finally, there was the sound of the world's skeleton snapping, ancient forests uprooted and crushed, cities of stone grinding into pebbles under the weight of miles of black water. And then, silence. A silence only broken by the eerie, rhythmic drumming of water against gopher wood. The divine equation was supposed to be final. 8 humans, 1 ark, 0 monsters. That was the contract signed in the heavens. But then, a sound violated every law of that equation. A heavy, wet, bone-jarring thud on the roof. While the Nephilim, those godlike hybrids born from angelic rebellion, The titans who had turned the earth into a laboratory of horrors were being dragged down by their own massive bone density into the abyss. One managed to defy the gravity of judgment. Og. He wasn't just a giant. He was a master of cold, calculated survival. Picture a 13-foot nightmare, his lungs burning with the stench of ozone, his muscles engineered by the celestial DNA of fallen stars. He swam through a sea of floating corpses, pushing aside the bloated remains of his own cousins, until his clawed fingers found the edge of the only vessel of salvation in existence. He didn't try to break in. He knew the ark was sealed by the hand of God himself, protected by an invisible seal that no creature of corrupted blood could breach. Instead, he did something far more sinister. He waited for a moment of human weakness. He bargained. Jewish Midrashic traditions whisper of this forbidden encounter, a moment deleted from the sanitized versions of history. Og, the last king of the Rephaim, shouting through the roar of the hurricane, his voice a gravelly thunder, "Noah, son of Lamech, I know you can hear me through the timber. I will be your slave. I will be the beast of burden for your sons until the stars fall from the sky. Just give me bread. Just let me breathe the air of the new world." Inside, Noah faced a choice that would ripple through 4 centuries of blood, giants, and war. To let Og drown was to fulfill God's mandate of total genetic eradication. To feed him was to preserve a virus that God was trying to cure. Moses, sitting in his tent hundreds of years later, feels this tension in his very marrow. The oil in his lamp splutters, casting long, giant-like shadows against the goat-hair walls of his tabernacle. He grips his stylus so hard the wood groans. "Did my forefather Noah see something in that monster's eyes that I am missing?" Moses whispers, his voice cracking in the dry desert air. Was it a spark of divine mercy, or was it the first sin of the post-flood world? My heart aches as I record these events. I see Noah, the man of God, standing beneath that small ventilation hatch. I see his hand, the hand that held the future of humanity, trembling as he slid scraps of moldy bread and rotted vegetables into the rain. By doing so, Noah didn't just save a creature, he saved a nightmare. He allowed a single, corrupted seed to cross the threshold into a world that was meant to be a clean slate. He gave the old world's darkness a ride into the new world's dawn. For a full year, Og lived as a parasite on the roof of the ark. He became a gargoyle of flesh and bone, clinging to the structural beams with a grip that could crush stone. His skin, scorched by the freezing winds and pickled by the endless salt spray, turned into a leathery grey armor. He watched the sun disappear and the stars go cold. Every day, at the same hour, the hatch would slide open. No words were exchanged, just the silent delivery of scraps. Each bite Og took was a stay of divine execution, funded by the mercy of a man who couldn't bear to hear the last monster scream anymore. When the ark finally ground against the mud of Ararat and the massive door swung open, the 8 humans stepped out into a silent, sun-drenched world. The air was sweet, the earth was new, but as they looked up, their shadows were joined by a third, much larger silhouette. A hulking 4-meter shape slid down the side of the hull like a lizard. Og didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't offer a sacrifice. He simply turned his cold, ancient eyes that had seen the world before the rain, toward the east. He walked toward the volcanic plains of Bashan, his footsteps leaving deep craters in the fresh mud, carrying the forbidden DNA of the Watchers into a future that was supposed to be free of them. But as Moses stared at the desert horizon, a darker thought struck him. If Og was the only physical survivor, why did his scouts report entire tribes of giants in the land of Canaan? The truth is far more disturbing than a monster on a roof. The corruption didn't just survive on the ark, it survived inside the very people God had chosen to save. If King Og was the only physical survivor of the Great Deluge, then the theological problem for Moses should have been simple: track down one aging monster, execute him, and the world is finally restored to its intended purity. But as Moses sat within the sacred dimness of the tabernacle, the flickering oil lamp casting long skeletal shadows against the goat hair walls, he stared at the intelligence reports brought back from the valley of Eshkol. The ink on the parchment seemed to bleed, forming the jagged shapes of nightmares. His blood turned to ice despite the desert heat. His scouts, men hand-picked for their iron nerves, didn't just describe a single king in Bashan. They reported the Anakim. They reported the Zuzim. They reported entire tribes of towering entities that made the mighty Hebrew warriors feel like grasshoppers in their own sight. A terrifying question began to echo in the heart of the prophet, louder than the howling Sinai wind. How did the poison return? If the Great Reset was perfect, if the Ark was a closed system of purity designed by the hand of God, how could a single survivor on a roof father 100 nations of giants? The math of the flood was supposed to equal 0 monsters. But Moses was looking at a sum that defied divine logic. He gripped his stylus, his mind racing back 4 centuries to the day the earth drowned. He realized that while the flood could drown the flesh, it couldn't drown the code. The corruption didn't just cross the ocean of death on the outside of the ark. It was carried inside, hidden like a silent, dormant parasite in the very bloodline God was trying to protect. The women, Moses whispers to the shifting shadows, his voice a mix of grief and chilling realization. The daughters of the old world, the carriers of the ghost. Noah was Tamim, perfect in his generations. His DNA was a pristine library, untainted by the angelic rebellion on Mount Hermon. But the Bible remains hauntingly silent about his 3 daughters-in-law. This is the first shocking truth Moses had to confront. These women were the bridge. They came from a world where the Nephilim were not just legends, but the kings, the gods, and the lovers of humanity for 1,000 years. The angelic DNA was like a silent virus, a genetic ghost lurking in the recessive traits of their blood. Moses closes his eyes and visualizes the horror of the stowaway theory. He sees Og not as a king, but as a desperate parasite. He sees the giant clinging to the structural beams of the ark, his 13-foot frame battered by waves that could flip mountains. He hears the rhythmic bone-chilling sound of Og's fists against the gopher wood. But even more disturbing is the image of Noah, the man of God, opening a small ventilation hatch in a moment of human weakness. Moses imagines the smell of salt and ozone as Noah slides scraps of moldy bread and rotted vegetables to the monster. Every bite Og took was a stay of divine execution, funded by the misplaced mercy of a man who couldn't bear to hear the last nightmare scream anymore. Did my forefather Noah realize what he was doing? Moses writes, the wood of his stylus creaking under the pressure. By feeding the beast on the roof, he kept the physical fossil alive. But by bringing the brides inside, he allowed the code to survive. The corruption of the Watchers was a master thief. It didn't just need a boat to survive the judgment, it needed a womb. It waited in the marrow. It was a phantom waiting for the right moment to reclaim the earth. As the descendants of Ham spread toward the volcanic plains and the lush valleys of Canaan, this genetic ghost began to manifest. Moses visualizes the horror of the first post-flood villages. He sees a mother looking at her newborn child and screaming as she sees eyes that hold the cold, predatory intelligence of a fallen star. He sees a father watching his son grow, not inches but feet. In a single year, the child's bones thickening into something closer to stone than calcium, his voice deepening into a sound that vibrated the very floorboards of their home. These children were too tall, their bones too dense, their hearts filled with an ancestral hunger for violence that no human education could tame. The Nephilim were back, not as a sudden invasion from the sky, but as a slow, creeping resurgence from within the human family tree. But as Moses dug deeper into the ancient records, he found a second, even more disturbing clue hidden in the phrase, "And also after that." Genesis 6 verse 4 was a warning. It meant the rebellion of the Watchers wasn't a single event in the distant past. The spiritual barrier between the dimensions had been thinned, a cosmic seal had been broken. Like predators sensing a fresh start, the fallen entities saw the post-flood world as a new laboratory. They didn't target the whole planet this time, they were surgical. They targeted the strategic ground. They targeted the land God had promised to the seed of Abraham. Moses looks at the map of Canaan, and for the first time, he sees it for what it truly is, a biological minefield. The giants weren't living there by accident or simple migration. They were placed there as a spiritual and physical barricade. The fallen ones knew that from the line of Abraham, the Messiah would come, the one who would crush the serpent's head forever. To prevent the birth of the Savior, they seeded the land with monsters. They resurrected the Rephaim. They created a wall of corrupted flesh and iron to stop the plan of God before it could even begin. I am not just leading a people to a home, Moses realizes, his eyes reflecting the flickering, dying flame of his lamp. I am an undertaker, sent to finish a burial that started in the days of Noah, but was left incomplete. I am the one who must purge the planet of this genetic plague once and for all. The flood used water to wash the surface. I must use the edge of the sword to cut into the heart of the infection. Every village of Anakim I destroy, every giant I fell, is a strike against the ghost that tried to hijack humanity's future. He thinks about Og, sitting on his black stone throne in Bashan. Og was the anchor. He was the original carrier, the primary source, who stood as a living inspiration for the newer, diluted tribes. Og was the only one who remembered the world before the rain. He was the bridge between the world of the angels and the world of the mud. The weight of this realization is crushing. Moses feels the eyes of the entire universe, the angels, the demons, and the unborn generations resting on his tired shoulders. He isn't fighting for territory or gold. He is fighting for the purity of the human image. He is fighting to ensure that the image of God is not permanently overwritten by the image of the fallen. Every giant he kills is not an act of war, but an act of restoration. He begins to understand the strategy of the enemy. The giants of Bashan were not just tall men, they were a second incursion. The Watchers had realized that a global infestation was too easy for God to wipe out, so they went small. They went targeted. They turned the promised land into a fortress of giants, hoping that the fear of the 4-meter kings would keep the Israelites wandering in the desert until they died out. "They want us to stay in the sand," Moses whispers, his resolve hardening. "They want us to be afraid of the glitch in the system, but they forget one thing. The God who sent the flood hasn't changed his mind about the Nephilim. If Og is the last remnant of that rebellion, then his throne is nothing more than a funeral pyre waiting to be lit." As the first light of dawn began to touch the desert sand, Moses called for Joshua. He didn't talk about land or milk and honey. He talked about the genetic phantoms they were about to face. He prepared them for a war that was as much about biology as it was about belief. The genetic ghost had survived the water, but it would not survive the fire. While the rest of the post-flood world was struggling to rebuild from the mud, using fragile sun-dried bricks and rotting timber, King Og was carving a permanent, immovable nightmare out of a stone that refused to yield to time. Bashan was not merely a kingdom, it was a psychological and physical prison known as the Argob, the rugged, stony tract. This region was a volcanic graveyard of black basalt, a mineral so dense and unforgiving that it seemed to have been designed by a mind that hated the very concept of human comfort. Here, the geology itself was a weapon. Every jagged cliff was a razor, and every canyon was a predatory throat. In this dark landscape, Og found a physical medium that matched the cold, prehistoric density of his own soul. Moses stared at the intelligence reports spread across his table, his eyes burning as he read the descriptions of the 60 cities. This was the first detail that defied all military logic. 60 fortified metropolises, all within a single region, all built to a scale that made human architecture look like children's toys. These were not villages of tents, they were bunkers of black rock. The walls loomed like artificial mountains, stacked with massive blocks of basalt, so heavy that no human labor force, no matter how many thousands of slaves were harnessed to the ropes, could have shifted them even an inch. There was a conspicuous absence of wood in Bashan's defenses. Og knew that wood was a material for the weak. It rots, it burns, it belongs to a shorter-lived species. In Bashan, everything was stone. Every gate to these 60 cities was a monumental slab of solid basalt, 15 feet high and nearly a foot thick, swinging on stone pivots carved directly into the bedrock. Moses' scouts reported a detail that made his blood run cold. They had watched from the shadows as Og approached these gates, pushing them open with a casual hand, a display of casual strength that would have required 20 human soldiers and a pulley system just to mimic. Moses gripped his stylus, the wood creaking as he imagined the sound of those gates closing at sunset. It would be a deep, grinding, bone-shaking roar, the sound of the earth's skeleton screaming against itself. It was a sound that signaled the absolute finality of a cage, a vibration that would rattle a man's teeth in his skull and let him know that he was no longer in the world of men. How do we breach a kingdom made of the earth's own bones? Moses wonders, his mind racing through the impossible logistics of a siege. I see my soldiers, men who grew up in the soft, hospitable clay of Egypt, staring at these black ramparts. They don't see a city to be conquered. They see a mountain that has been taught to hate. Og didn't build these for protection. He built them as a monument to his own permanence. He wanted the world to know that while the floodwaters could wash away mud and flesh, they could never move the basalt. He has turned the very geology of the earth into a defiant shield for his rebellion against the truest creator. He sits behind a wall of stone, waiting for the world to tire of trying to move him. Inside these cities, the architecture was a violent violation of human proportions. The stairs were not steps, but massive ledges, too steep for human legs, designed for a stride that could cover a valley in a single breath. The ceilings were so high, they disappeared into the swirling, acrid torch smoke, creating a crushing sense of being trapped inside a hollowed-out volcano. But it was the Argob, the royal district, that held the true, suffocating horror. At its center sat the throne room, a cavernous hall carved into the heart of a prehistoric volcanic plateau. There were no windows, for Og had seen enough of the sky during the Great Deluge. He hated the sun, for it reminded him of the divine light he had forfeited. Instead, the hall was illuminated only by the dim, sickly orange flicker of torches mounted in forged iron brackets. The black stone didn't reflect this light. It seemed to drink it, absorbing every photon into its dark, thirsty surface, leaving the corners of the room in a state of eternal, predatory twilight. This throne room was the center of a global system of fear and tribute. Og sat on a throne of polished basalt, receiving emissaries from terrified nations who traveled for months just to beg for his mercy. They didn't bring prayers. They brought caskets of gold, silver, and grain. This wasn't trade. It was protection money, paid to a king who refused to age or die. Og would sit in silence, a hulking shadow in the center of the gloom, letting the sheer weight of his presence do the talking. Every emissary was forced to walk past his iron bed, 13 feet of cold, custom-forged metal. It was a psychological weapon. It told every visitor that the creature they were dealing with was so heavy, so dense, and so alien that the very earth's wood would splinter under his rest. It was a statement of power. I am the Iron King, and you are but insects of the field. Bashan became known as the gateway to the underworld. Og didn't just rule a kingdom, he operated a cult. In deep, lightless caves beneath the basalt cities, he resurrected the forbidden rituals of the pre-flood world. He claimed to be the only living link to the ancestors, the fallen titans, and Nephilim kings who had been drowned by God. He whispered to spirits that should have remained buried under the waves of the deluge, performing ceremonies of blood and iron that turned his territory into a preserved bubble of the old world's darkness. He encouraged the belief that his bones were stone and his blood was divine, convincing the surrounding nations that the flood was a failure and that he was the living proof of God's limitation. Og's cruelty was not random. It was a calculated system of dominance. He would allow certain kingdoms to thrive just enough so they could produce the gold he demanded. He was a biological glitch that had built a stone cage for the human soul. Every harvest season, the roads to Bashan were choked with livestock and treasures, a constant stream of wealth flowing into a kingdom that produced nothing but fear. He wanted the descendants of Noah to look at his 60 black towers and believe that the image of the fallen was the only image that mattered. He collects the treasures of a world he hates, Moses writes, his hand aching from the intensity of his thoughts. He sits on his iron bed, listening to the wind whistle through the basalt, and he believes he has outlasted God's wrath. He has turned the volcanic rock into a monument to his survival. My mission is not just to conquer land. It is to shatter this black nightmare and prove that even the hardest basalt must crumble before the breath of the living God. The iron of his bed will not save him when the iron of our resolve arrives. I must tear down every gate, smash every throne, and erase the gateway to the underworld so that humanity can finally breathe the air of the new world without his shadow over them. As the Israelite army moved closer to the borders of Bashan, the fear did something unexpected. It didn't just paralyze the soldiers, it began to infect their very dreams. They started to hear things in the night, sounds of heavy, rhythmic footsteps that didn't belong to their own sentries, a vibration that made the ground groan under a weight that shouldn't exist. Og wasn't just waiting behind his walls. He was already beginning his march inside their minds. The king of Bashan knew that a fortress is only as strong as the fear it inspires, and he had been perfecting that fear for 400 years. But as Moses prepared the final battle plans, a scout burst into the tent with news that changed everything. Og had emptied his 60 cities. He wasn't waiting for a siege. He was marching his entire army of giants and subjects to a single location, Edrei, The last nightmare of the old world was coming out to play, and he was choosing the ground where Israel would either rise as a nation or die as grasshoppers. The Israelite camp was swallowed by a silence so heavy it felt as if the Sinai desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for a cosmic collision. Inside the tabernacle, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of holy incense and the musk of old parchment, but it brought no peace to Moses. He sat alone, the flickering golden light of the menorah casting long, jagged shadows against the acacia wood walls, shadows that seemed to stretch and loom like the giants he was destined to face. On the table before him lay the intelligence reports from the valley of Eshcol and the borders of Bashan. These were not just military briefings, they were the collective screams of a nation's courage failing. The reports were devastating. Moses' scout had returned pale, their voices hollowed out by a primal terror. "We were in our own sight as grasshoppers," they had whispered, a phrase that now haunted the camp like a funeral dirge. They didn't just describe an army, they described a violation of the natural order. They spoke of the Anakim, whose heads touched the lower clouds, and they spoke of the king of Bashan. They spoke of Og not as a man, but as a mountain of flesh and iron that didn't belong in this sun-drenched era. Moses gripped the edge of the cedar table, his 80-year-old knuckles white and trembling. He felt the crushing weight of 40 years of desert wandering pressing down on his spine. He wasn't just leading a people to a homeland, he was carrying a theological crisis that threatened to undo everything they believed. "Lord," Moses whispered into the sacred dimness, his voice cracking with the dryness of the desert and the burden of his soul. "The flood was your perfect surgery. It was supposed to be the final amputation of the corrupted seed from Mount Hermon. The divine equation was set in stone, 8 humans, 0 monsters. Yet, the genetic ghost has returned. Og stands at our gates as a living, breathing mockery of the Ark. Why must this old man be the one to finish what the great deluge left behind? Why am I the undertaker for a nightmare that refused to stay buried?" Moses realized that the real battlefield wasn't the jagged volcanic plains of Edrei, it was the infected spirit of his people. The fear was spreading like a biological plague through the tents, a dark contagion that whispered of doom. He could hear the muffled weeping of mothers at night, the frantic prayers of elders, and the rhythmic, hollow sound of soldiers checking their bronze spears with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The Israelites had seen God dismantle the gods of Egypt, but those were gods of stone and myth. Now they were facing a god of iron and basalt, a living fossil from a world of giants. Moses agonized over his own mortality. He was 80, his breath was short, his eyes were dimming, and his legs felt the pull of the earth. In contrast, the report said Og hadn't aged a day in 400 years. How do you fight a man who has outlived the apocalypse? How do you command a nation of slaves to charge against a king whose bed is made of the very metal they are just learning to forge? Suddenly, the air in the tabernacle grew static, charged with a sudden, localized lightning that made the hairs on Moses' arms stand up. The presence of the Almighty didn't arrive as a gentle whisper this time. It arrived as a cosmic decree that vibrated through the very foundations of the earth. "Do not fear him," the voice echoed, not in Moses' ears, but in the very marrow of his bones, rattling his ribs. "For I have delivered him into your hand with all his people and all his land." Moses froze, his stylus dropping from his numb fingers. "I have delivered, not I will." In the dimension of the eternal, the 4-meter king was already a fallen corpse. The 60 basalt cities were already dust. God was speaking in the past perfect tense. The victory was a finished, historical fact in the eyes of the Creator. Moses was simply the physical instrument assigned to manifest that victory in the realm of time and space. This realization shattered the prophet's doubt like glass. He wasn't a general gambling his people's lives on a risky battle. He was a surgeon performing the final, decisive stitch of a 400-year-old operation. "I am the Undertaker," Moses whispered, his resolve hardening into something colder, sharper, and far more permanent than the iron of Og's bed. "I am the one sent to close the open loop of the pre-flood world. If Og is the last remnant of the Watcher's rebellion, then I am the flame sent to consume the dry stubble of that era." He stood up, his posture straightening, the weariness of 80 years momentarily eclipsed by a divine momentum. He walked to the entrance of the tabernacle and pulled back the heavy curtain. He looked toward the north, where the moon sat high over the jagged black silhouettes of the Bashan mountains. He knew that inside those 60 fortresses, Og was preparing. The last survivor of the drowned world, the man who had bargained with Noah for bread and scraps, was now preparing to bargain with the angel of death. Moses felt a strange, detached pity for the creature. Og was a biological glitch, a fossil that had overstayed its epoch, a shadow that didn't realize the sun was finally rising. "You survived the water, Og," Moses thought, his eyes fixed on the distant volcanic horizon. "You hid in the DNA of the brides. You clung to the roof of the ark while your brothers screamed beneath the waves. You built a kingdom of stone to defy the stars and mock the judgment of the heavens, but you cannot survive the word. Tomorrow, the reset button will be pressed again, not with water, but with the edge of a prophet's resolve. And this time, there will be no hatch for you to hide in. This time, the math will finally equal 0. Moses called for Joshua, his voice no longer that of a weary old man, but the roar of the desert wind that moves mountains of sand. "Tell the men to cease their weeping. Tell them to sharpen their blades, not for a fight, but for a reaping. We do not march to Edrei to see if we can win. We march to Edrei to collect a debt that has been owed since the days of Noah. God has already spoken the end of Bashan. We are merely the witnesses of his final period at the end of a long, dark sentence." The news of Moses' renewed strength spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. The past perfect promise of God began to overwrite the present terror of the giants. But even as the soldiers found their courage, Moses remained in his tent, staring at his hands. He knew the cost. He knew that to erase the last monster of Genesis, he would have to lead his people into the mouth of a basalt hell. He was ready to be the surgeon, but he knew that surgery always involved blood. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon on the morning of the march, a scout burst into the tent, gasping for air. "He's not in the cities, Moses. Og has moved. He's not waiting for a siege. He's standing in the open plain of Edrei, alone at the front of his army, waiting for us. He's brought the mountain to the valley. The final collision was no longer a plan, it was a reality." The morning at Edrei did not break with the soft, promising light of a typical desert dawn. Instead, it arrived with a suffocating, unnatural heat and a sky the color of bruised, oxidized iron. The Israelite army, hundreds of thousands strong, stood positioned at the jagged edge of the volcanic plateau, their bronze shields forming a vast, shimmering sea of dull orange reflection. But the soldiers were not looking at the horizon for the rising sun. Every eye was fixed downward into the valley of Edrei, where the impossible had taken physical shape. King Og did not hide behind the 15-foot basalt gates of his 60 cities. In a final, arrogant display of the genetic glitch that had successfully defied the heavens for 400 years, he had emptied his fortresses and brought his entire military force into the open field. He wanted the Israelites to see their doom clearly. At the very front of the giant's formation stood Og himself, and the sight of him caused a wave of physical nausea to ripple through the Hebrew ranks. He was a vision of prehistoric, antediluvian terror, a 13-foot living fossil draped in armor that looked as if it had been hammered and cooled directly from the Earth's molten core. His breastplate was a single, massive slab of polished black basalt, etched with glowing, angular symbols that predated the invention of human language, the celestial script of the fallen watchers. In his massive, tree-trunk-sized hands, he gripped a weapon that defied the physics of the Bronze Age, a jagged, obsidian-edged greatsword, the length of 3 grown men, its surface reflecting no light, only a cold, dark void. As Moses stepped to the absolute front of the Israelite line, the very ground beneath his sandals began to vibrate in a rhythmic, terrifying pattern. It wasn't an earthquake or a geological shift. It was the biological thud of Og's heart, a heart engineered by forbidden celestial DNA, beating with a hydraulic force that could be felt in the marrow of every man standing within a mile of him. Og's voice suddenly rolled across the valley like the sound of 2 tectonic plates grinding against one another in a sunless abyss. It was a sound that did not belong to human vocal cords. It was a deep, resonant vibration that made the soldiers' bronze spears rattle in their hands. Noah's pathetic descendant, the giant roared, his ancient eyes glowing with a cold, predatory intelligence that had seen the world drown and survive. The great flood waters failed to swallow me. The passing centuries failed to wither my skin or weaken my bone. Do you truly believe, you prophet of mud and dying bone, that you can succeed where the heavens themselves left the work incomplete? I am the error that cannot be deleted. I am the mountain that refuses to move. Moses felt the fear ripple through his people like a contagious, paralyzing plague. His soldiers, the very men who had been called grasshoppers by the scouts, were physically backing away, their heels digging deep, desperate furrows into the soft volcanic sand. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and sweat. Moses closed his eyes for a single focused heartbeat, recalling the past perfect promise he had received within the sacred silence of the tabernacle. I have delivered him. He realized in that moment that Og's terrifying arrogance was his only remaining shield. The giant believed his survival was proof of a divine mistake, an exemption to the laws of the universe. I am not here to succeed through my own strength, Og, Moses whispered, his voice caught by the desert wind, but suddenly amplified by a divine momentum that made it carry across the entire valley. I am here merely to manifest the burial that God already completed in the heavens before the sun rose this morning. You are not a king. You are a debt that is finally being called due. The battle did not begin with a standard military charge. It began with a geological cataclysm that silenced the breathing of every man present. Og did not wait for his infantry of lesser giants and subjects. He reached down into the base of a nearby volcanic outcrop, his clawed, massive fingers digging deep into the ancient bedrock. With a primal roar that seemed to split the very dome of the sky, Og literally tore the jagged summit of a mountain from its foundation. The Israelites watched in a state of paralyzed, screaming horror as the last king of the Rephaim hoisted a 50-ton mass of black volcanic rock high above his head. His celestial muscles bulged beneath his basalt armor, the stone plates on his shoulders groaning and cracking under the immense, unnatural strain. This was the ultimate violation of the laws of nature. With a violent, earth-shaking heave, Og threw the mountain peak. It arched through the air like a black moon blotting out the sun, a colossal shadow hurtling toward the very center of the Israelite camp. But as the shadow of the falling mountain enveloped the people and death seemed certain, the divine dimension finally intervened in a way that defied every human expectation. From the empty air itself, a sudden deafening buzzing sound emerged, a sound so loud and so high-pitched it drowned out the screams of the terrified soldiers. Thousands upon thousands of insects, a swarm of divine hornets appearing from the Ke-Nut of reality, descended upon the suspended rock. They did not just bite or sting, they formed a dense, living, swarming barricade of gold and black wings that physically held the 50-ton mountain peak in midair, catching it like a ball in a net of divine energy, defying every known law of gravity and physics. Og's massive jaw dropped in genuine shock. The glitch had finally met the debugger. The swarm of insects did not stop at the rock. They turned their collective, buzzing fury upon the giant himself. They blinded him, crawling into the narrow gaps of his volcanic armor, stinging the ancient, leathery skin that had once survived the corrosive salt of the Great Flood. Og staggered backward, swatting blindly at the air with his massive obsidian blade, his 4-meter frame stumbling like a drunken titan across the uneven terrain. The mountain peak fell, but not on the people of Israel. It crashed onto the empty, rocky plain beside the battlefield, the impact sending a massive seismic shockwave that knocked thousands of soldiers off their feet and shattered the black basalt gates of the nearby fortress cities into 1,000,000 fragments.
Forward!
"Now!" Moses screamed, his voice no longer that of a weary 80-year-old man, but the cold, sharp command of a divine executioner. The Israelites, seeing their supposed god-king blinded, stung and broken, found a savage, desperate courage they didn't know they possessed. They rushed the giant in coordinated, screaming waves, their bronze spears aimed at the gaps in his armor. They were no longer fighting a deity, they were fighting a wounded, prehistoric animal. But even blinded and swarmed by insects, Og remained a catastrophic weapon of war. He swung his massive blade in wide, desperate, blind arcs, cleaving through bronze shields, wooden chariots, and entire infantry formations like a scythe through dry summer wheat. The blood on the volcanic soil was thick, dark, and smelled of something older than humanity. Moses realized he had to be the one to deliver the final blow. He did not reach for a holy relic. He picked up a standard-issue Israelite battle axe, simple iron and weathered wood. He ran toward the center of the swirling, bloody chaos. He did not look up at the giant's terrifying height or the glowing symbols on his chest. He looked only at the giant's foundation. As he neared the 13-foot monster, Moses saw the one remaining vulnerability. Even in a body engineered by the forbidden genetics of the fallen angels, the tendons had to be anchored to the bone to facilitate movement. 10 feet away from the staggering giant, Moses planted his foot into the ash and jumped. He did not jump with the strength of an old man. He was propelled by the same unseen force that had once split the Red Sea into 2 walls of water. He aimed for the back of Og's right stance, the one place where the basalt leg guards had to leave a gap for the movement of the heel. The iron axe connected with a sickening, crystalline crack that sounded like the breaking of a massive diamond. Moses had struck the Achilles heel of the last Nephilim. The giant's roar of agony shook the very stars in the sky. His massive leg gave way catastrophically. The 4-meter frame, a masterpiece of forbidden ancient genetics, suddenly became its own worst enemy. Gravity, the force Og had mocked and defied for over 4 centuries, finally reclaimed its debt with interest. Og crashed forward, his face hitting the volcanic rock with a sound like a falling fortress tower. The dust of the old world exploded upward in a massive grey cloud that momentarily obscured the sun. As the dust slowly settled, Moses stood over the fallen, gasping king. Og was on his back now, his chest heaving like a dying bellows, his ancient glowing eyes finally finding Moses through the swarm of insects. The mockery and the arrogance were gone, replaced by a terrifying, lucid clarity. For the first time in 400 years, Og looked small. "Your bones might be made of the earth's stone," Moses said quietly, his voice echoing in the sudden, eerie silence of the battlefield. "But your tendons are still made of flesh, and all flesh, no matter how ancient or corrupted, must always fail before the breath of the living God. You are the last open loop in the story of the flood, Og, and today I close you forever." Moses raised the iron axe one last time, silhouetted against the bruised sky. He did not look away from the giant's eyes. He struck with the absolute finality of a period at the end of a long, dark sentence. The genetic ghost that had crossed the flood, the passenger who had hidden in the DNA of the brides and clung to the rain-slicked roof of the ark, was finally extinguished. The cosmic math was finally perfectly balanced. 8 humans on the ark, 0 giants left in the land of the living. The great reset that had started with the falling of rain had finally been completed with the falling of an axe at Edrei. The world was finally, truly, for humans alone. But as the Israelite soldiers began to cheer, Moses noticed something strange. The giant's body didn't decay like a normal man's. It began to turn cold as the basalt of his cities. Moses realized that the physical evidence of this monster could not just be left to rot. It had to be dealt with, or the ghost of the Nephilim would never truly leave the minds of men. The dust of Edrei eventually settled over the volcanic plains of Bashan, but the silence that followed was not the peaceful stillness of a battlefield at rest. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a completed cosmic execution. King Og, the 13-foot living fossil of a drowned world, lay broken on the jagged basalt he had once called his eternal kingdom. His massive obsidian blade, which had cleaving through bronze and bone for 4 centuries, now lay shattered into useless glass shards. His glowing celestial eyes, which had looked upon the world before the rain, had finally dimmed into a cold, grey void. For the first time since the days of Noah, the rhythmic, bone-shaking heartbeat of the Rephaim had ceased. The genetic glitch was officially offline, and the last anchor of the old world's darkness had been severed from the earth. Moses stood over the fallen titan, his breathing ragged, the iron axe still heavy and stained in his hand. He looked down at the massive body, a terrifying masterpiece of forbidden genetics and ancient angelic rebellion, and he knew that his task as a prophet was not yet finished. He understood that he couldn't simply leave this monumental corpse to rot or to be devoured by the vultures of the desert. In his prophetic wisdom, Moses saw the danger of a lingering shadow. If a single strand of this corrupted DNA survived, if a single bone was discovered by future generations and turned into a relic by some dark cult, the genetic ghost would find a way to re-enter the human story. Moses was a surgeon of history, and he knew that an infection must be completely excised. "The fire must consume what the water missed," Moses commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that silenced the celebratory cheers of his men. The Israelites spent the next several days gathering every scrap of timber from the surrounding valleys. They dismantled their own wooden siege engines and stripped the scorched, dry brush of the Argob region to construct a funeral pyre the size of a small fortress. For 3 days and 3 nights, the body of King Og burned with an intensity that illuminated the night sky for miles. The smoke was thick, greasy, and smelled of something ancient and metallic, the distinct smell of celestial blood being erased from the physical realm forever. As the flames licked the clouds, Moses watched the basalt armor of the giant melt into slag, and the massive, dense bones turn into fine white ash. He was closing the final, open loop of the Genesis narrative. The math of the universe was finally being restored to its perfect, intended state. 8 humans saved by the ark, and 0 monsters left to claim the promised land. However, Moses was also a man of profound forensic foresight. He knew that in the centuries to come, the hearts of men would grow cold and their memories would fade. He knew that skeptics and wise men would rise, looking at the fertile, peaceful valleys of Canaan and calling the stories of the giants nothing more than fables, nomadic myths, or poetic exaggerations of a tribal war. They would say that Moses had merely fought tall men, not ancient horrors. To combat this inevitable future doubt, Moses preserved one piece of undeniable physical evidence. He did not take Og's crown or his riches. He took the iron bed of Rabbah, the 13 by 6 foot frame of custom-forged metal. Moses ordered this iron witness to be taken to the city of the Ammonites and put on permanent public display. He did not keep it as a trophy of pride. He kept it as a forensic anchor. He ensured that the exact measurements were recorded in the Holy Scriptures, Deuteronomy 3:11, so that thousands of years later, humanity would have a material reference for the scale of the nightmare they had faced. "Look at the iron," Moses was saying to the generations of the future. "Iron does not lie like a human tongue." A wooden bed would have splintered into dust under his 4-ton weight. If the bed exists, the monster was real. And if the monster was real, then the God who judged him is real, and his word is the only absolute truth. Now, we fast forward through the millennia to the year 2026. Why does the story of a dead king and an iron bed matter to us today, in an age defined by silicon, satellites, and artificial intelligence? Because the genetic ghost that Moses thought he had incinerated at Edrei is stirring once again in the modern world. We live in an era where the boundaries of biology are being pushed further than the watchers of Mount Hermon ever dreamed. We are no longer just observing the human code, we are actively editing it, rearranging it, and debugging it according to our own flawed desires. In 2026, CRISPR technology, neural link interfaces, and synthetic biology have become the new watchers of our time. We are once again standing at the precipice of a global genetic incursion. Some of our most brilliant scientists openly discuss the de-extinction of prehistoric monsters. Others experiment with human augmentation, seeking to create transhuman soldiers who are faster, stronger, and more resilient than any natural-born man. Without realizing it, we are reaching back into the same forbidden toolbox that once produced the Nephilim. We are creating our own glitches in the system, believing we can control the darkness better than those who lived before the rain. The 2026 connection is a chilling, urgent warning for the modern soul. Moses realized that the giants were more than just enemies. They were a biological barricade built to prevent the arrival of the Savior and the preservation of the human image. Today, the new giants are the digital and biological systems we build that threaten to overwrite the image of God with a post-human image. We are rebuilding the 60 cities of Bashan, not with black basalt, but with petabytes of data and modified gene sequences. We are constructing a new gateway to the underworld, arrogant enough to believe we can outsmart the judgment of the heavens. The story of King Og ends with a cremation and an iron bed, but the spiritual lesson remains eternal and unchanging. Corruption does not simply vanish because we choose to ignore it. It hides. It lingers in the recessive traits of our culture, waiting for a moment of human weakness to manifest. It clings to the roof of our scientific progress, just as Og once clung to the roof of the ark. Moses' victory at Edrei was more than a military conquest. It was a necessary purification of the human story. He proved that the created must always answer to the Creator, and that even a 13-foot glitch is no match for the word that spoke the universe into existence. As you look at the world in 2026, remember the iron bed of Rabbah. Remember the 50-ton mountain held in mid-air by a swarm of divine insects. The battle for the human image and the divine code did not end in the valley of Edrei. It is still ongoing in our labs, in our screens, and in our hearts. The question for our generation is simple. Will we protect the purity of our design, or will we allow the genetic ghost to take the throne once more? Moses did his part. He finished the surgery. He closed the loop. Now the stylus is in our hands, and the world is watching. The story of the last giant isn't just a record of the past. It is a map for our survival. Do not let the shadow of Bashan grow again. The great reset is coming, and this time there may not be an iron bed left behind to remind us of who we once were.